I used Imperial Rome as the model for my legion precisely because it was so foreign, so alien. I'd seen what had become of the NCR's attempts to emulate the culture of pre-war America, the infighting, the corruption. Rome was a highly militarized autocracy that effectively integrated the foreign cultures it conquered. It dedicated its citizens to something higher than themselves, to the idea of Rome itself. In Rome, I found a template for a society equal to the challenges of the post-apocalyptic world, a society that could and would survive, a society that could prevent mankind from fracturing and destroying itself in this new world by establishing a new Pax Romana. It means a nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of every group it conquers. Long-term stability at all costs. The individual has no value beyond his utility to the state, whether as an instrument of war or production. No, I'll destroy it because it's inevitable that it be destroyed. It's Hegelian dialectics, not personal animosity.
Many players hear Caesar's tense speech in New Vegas and shrug it off as a joke version philosophy. He drops a simplified history lesson, leans on the thesis, antithesis, synthesis formula, and sounds at first glance like someone who skimmed a pop-Hegel summary to justify his brutality. It is easy to dismiss his knowledge of Hegel and leave it there. Start with the obvious complaint. Caesar talks of the NCR as a decaying republic, the legion as a fierce counterforce, and that their clash will yield a new and stronger order. He wraps that in a simplified Hegelian rhythm. To anyone who has seen thesis, antithesis, synthesis on a bunch of half-baked infographics, the scene feels shallow by default. People then assume that Caesar's philosophy is no deeper than the cliche he uses. There are two mistakes here. The first concerns Hegel. The tidy triad comes from later readers who tried to compress a dense system into a digestible pattern. Hegel frames history as the unfolding of spirit through conflict and reconciliation, so the triad is not completely alien to him. Yet he does not write in that three-step buzz phrase. The second mistake concerns Caesar himself. Inside the story, he is a former follower of the apocalypse, who grew up in an intellectual setting, translated texts, and spent years thinking about Rome, empire, and decline. The courier is a drifter with no formal education that we ever saw. Caesar has one chance to justify his entire project to this stranger.
How do I put this basically enough?
Of course he reaches for the simplest shape he can find. The triad is but scaffolding for talking with someone he assumes has never read a line of serious philosophy. Reading that speech as a simplification aimed at the courier shifts the question from, does he recite Hegel correctly, to what kind of mind reaches for Hegelian themes at all, and how does he live them out? Edward Sallow becomes far more than what shallow pop deconstructions of his character suggest. Edward Sallow treats the post-war world as history's unfolding. The NCR, most settlers and many tribes act as if the bombs were an act of nature. They treat the old world as a glorious lost age or a pile of salvage. Sallow, meanwhile, reads about Rome and the United States as examples of a pattern. Republics grow, become wealthy, lose discipline, and rot from within. Outside them stand harder forces that can either destroy them or remake them. This way of thinking is already Hegelian in structure. History sees forms of life arise, realize their inner limits, then give way to new forms. Sallow sees the NCR as a revival of pre-war America that has carried its inner contradictions straight into the wasteland out of mere nostalgia. Bureaucracy without clarity, law without genuine strength, elections without deep civic unity, expansion without a real theory of empire. He identifies those contradictions and builds his own power as their living enemy. His biographical details match this reading. Sallow grows up with books rather than guns. He goes east as a missionary and finds tribes who live close to the edge of survival. He does not return to the followers and file a report, instead deciding to seize the historical moment. He applies what he has read about Rome to his new circumstances. He takes the tribes, burns away their separate customs, crushes their names, and forges an army. He behaves like someone who has absorbed a philosophy of history and decided to act on it. Freedom as inquiry on the causes of necessity. Hegel writes in Phenomenology of Spirit on a struggle between lord and bondsman. Two self-conscious beings risk their lives for recognition. One recoils from death and ends up in the position of the bondsman. The other stands firm and becomes the Lord. On the surface, the Lord wins. He commands, consumes, and enjoys. The bondsman works, obeys, and fears. Hegel then turns this picture inside out. The bondsman labors on the world. Under the threat of death, he learns that reality can be shaped, that objects change under his hands, and that his own effort is what gives the Lord's so-called freedom any substance. He also learns that life is finite and contingent. Fear and work become teachers. The Lord remains far away from the hard outer shell of the real. He lives off the bondsman's effort and depends on the bondsman's recognition. The person who seems sovereign ends up strangely hollow. The person who seemed crushed gains the more concrete grasp of how things actually stand. Hegel thus defines the world spirit as the shared life of a people, their institutions, habits, ways of talking about themselves, and the forms of recognition they grant each other. Spirit grows clearer to itself when human beings discover how much of their world is made rather than given. The bondsman's insight into labor, risk, and dependence belongs to spirit as a whole. A society becomes more spiritual, in Hegel's sense, when more of its members grasp the forces that shape their world. Thus, Hegel defines freedom not as arbitrary choice, but as understanding. Freedom, for him, is insight into necessity. A person, or a people, becomes free when they stop seeing their world as a blind fate and start seeing it as a structure with causes, limits, and alternatives. Spirit advances when men and women ask, why must things be this way? Could they be otherwise? That inquiry marks the passage from mere endurance to historical self-consciousness. The Mojave, before Caesar's advance, largely lacks this kind of reflection. Most people treat their conditions as brute facts. Water is scarce, raiders exist, NCR taxes go up, caravans are hit, and the dam matters because everyone says it does. The NCR itself treats its own institutions as self-justifying. A constitution, elections, a flag, a chain of command. These appear as necessities that follow from civilization rather than as choices embedded in a specific history. In that sense, both settlers and officials inhabit a world that simply is, rather than one that is constantly interrogated. Edward Sallow's project intensifies necessity to the point where it can no longer be taken for granted. The Legion does not merely make life hard, it makes power visible. Crucifixions, slave columns, and burning towns announce that how things are is the result of deliberate will. The NCR being at Hoover Dam stops looking like a natural fact about the wasteland and starts looking like a contested decision. The very brutality of Caesar's methods drags the hidden causes of suffering into daylight. Someone chose this timing, this campaign, this frontier line, this set of laws and punishments. In Hegel's sense, that is the precondition for freedom. People cannot become free if they think their world is but a storm or a drought. They become free when they see their world as a human order with an internal logic. Caesar, by forcing the NCR, New Vegas, the followers, and the tribes into an open crisis, compels them to ask what had previously been decorously ignored. Why does the NCR expand? Why is the dam non-negotiable? Why should this republic, or this casino oligarchy, or this tribe survive rather than another? What necessitates their institutions and what merely props them up? In each case, the courier must answer questions about necessity. They decide which constraints are truly unavoidable and which have been smuggled in under the cover of habit, nostalgia, or fear. That act of judgment is what Hegel would recognize as the beginning of freedom. The Mojave does not become free by escaping necessity, but by interrogating it, by tracing its causes, weighing its legitimacy, and choosing which form of life to bind itself to. Edward Sallow himself does not conduct this inquiry in a liberal key. He believes that he has already grasped necessity. The wasteland demands a Rome, demands slavery, demands fear. In that sense, he closes off questions within his own camp, yet precisely by colliding with the NCR and New Vegas, he opens those questions for everyone else. His legion is the pressure that forces the region to think. Freedom, in Hegel's sense, appears not in the NCR's nostalgia, but in the reflective turmoil that Caesar creates. By making necessity so stark, he compels the Mojave to ask why it must be so, and whether it must remain so. Hegel's world historical individual. Now spirit does not only advance to diffuse, anonymous experience. At certain moments, it gathers itself into single, highly placed actors who concentrate and ages pressures into their own decisions. The same man who turns the Mojave into a field of forced self-interrogation also stands at the center of the war that will decide what kind of order follows the stunned aftermath of the bombs. Hegel describes these kinds of people as world historical figures. They gather up the needs of an age into their own ambition and push history through a turning point. They usually do this through war and upheaval. They treat moral codes and existing laws as tools or obstacles rather than as sacred limits. They pursue their own passion, yet that passion lines up with a larger shift in how a society understands itself. Hegel links these figures to three key traits. They see further than their contemporaries and grasp the direction in which things must move. They show an iron will that can use coercion on a vast scale. They burn out. The new order that follows them may keep their name or erase it, yet either way, their personal project ends in exhaustion, death, or defeat. Their role lies in breaking and founding rather than ruling in peace. Edward Salow fits this pattern with unsettling precision. He understands the Mojave as a crossroads. To his eyes, the wasteland sits between scattered tribal life and a new continent-wide state. The NCR tries to fill that role with old symbols and institutions. Salow sees that this project carries the seeds of collapse. The NCR stretches supply lines too far, denies its own imperial character, and drowns every frontier town in red tape. He speaks about this with cold clarity in his tent. That clarity of diagnosis marks him as more than a warlord with a Roman hobby. He also shows the second trait, the use of coercion and brutality as instruments. Caesar's legion runs on slavery, crucifixion, and absolute obedience. This does not arise from cruelty for its own sake. He explains to the courier that medicine, mercy, and softness make no sense in early stages of state building under those conditions. His judgment may horrify us, yet it proceeds from a consistent view of what this age requires. He believes the wasteland has grown used to half measures, charity, and improvisation. He answers with extremes. The third trait, burnout, is woven into his story. Salow has a tumor in his brain. His empire revolves around his person. General Lanius, Volfus Inculta, and the others are tools, not peers. The Legion's myths exalt him as the founding figure. He builds no real mechanism for succession. He behaves as if he either wins Hoover Dam in person or the project loses its soul. Hegel describes world historical individuals as people whom spirit uses then discards. Caesar stands on that track the moment you enter his camp. Corrosion and the labor of the negative. Hegel puts what he calls negation at the forefront of his thought. A given form of life reaches its limit and finally meets its contrary. Through struggle, both sides are altered, and something new arises. This is not always a gentle process. War, revolution, and conquest often do the work. In that sense, history has a dark engine. Edward Salow commits himself to acting as that dark engine for the Mojave. He looks at both the NCR civil order and tribal disorder, then treats both as bankrupt. The NCR speaks in the language of rights and law while it spreads corruption, economic domination, and military occupation. The tribes cling to local ritual and small-scale life in a world that now contains industrial ruins, national armies, and energy weapons. Neither side, in his eyes, has a viable answer. He responds with a project whose core is destruction and remaking. He wipes out tribal identities and forges one army from their remains. He makes public torture into a language that anyone can understand. He marches on the NCR not to loot a few caravans, but to smash an entire political project. Through all of this, he keeps up a running commentary on what kind of state must grow out of the ruins. That mix of reflection and violence is exactly the combination Hegel describes. Spirit does not change through quiet persuasion alone. It changes through acts that are at once conscious and blind. Caesar knows what he wants, yet he cannot foresee what the Mojave will build from his wreckage. It matters that Salow's violence is surrounded by intellectual justification. Raiders kill for gain, rage, or sport. Pretender strongmen often talk in vague myths. Salow speaks about decadence, founding, and necessity. He wants Hoover Dam and New Vegas as symbols. Control of the dam means control of the future of the Southwest. A world historical figure thinks in these grand units. NCR nostalgia and Salow's opposition. The NCR gives us a contrast that sharpens Salow's Hegelian cast. The new California Republic tries to reassemble the pre-war United States from fragments. It brings back flags, bicameral legislatures, elections, embassies, constitutions, representative bodies, all the paraphernalia of a lost republic and a certain idea of normal life. It treats the Great War as a disaster that interrupted a basically sound form of society. It assumes that if those institutions stand again, the world will right itself. Hegel would denounce this act as spiritual evasion. A catastrophe on that scale reflects the inner failure of a form of life that has exhausted its internal logic. A serious philosophy of history would read the bombs as judgment on the old world. The proper response would be a new institutional form that learns from the ruin in a deep way. Instead, the NCR clings to old paperwork and old myths. It extends its reach, taxes, signs treaties, and acts as if the past can be brought back at gunpoint. Spirit, however, demands reflection, and the NCR answers with sentiment. It clings to the appearance of constitutional order and pretends that constitutes recovery. Hegel suspects this sort of nostalgia. He does not write as a romantic who dreams of lost golden ages. Forms of ethical life have their time, reach their limits, and pass away. A serious philosophy of history takes catastrophe as a verdict. It looks for the contradictions that made the fall inevitable. It then seeks institutions that do more than copy the old pattern with fewer resources. In that light, the NCR's project comes across as spiritually thin. It extends its reach, pushes laws and taxes eastward, and keeps insisting that the bombs change the landscape, rather than the idea of the state itself. Salo understands that the NCR's claim to be the heir of the old world locks it into the old world's blind spots. Its leaders talk about citizenship and democracy while they run an overextended oligarchic war machine. They send conscripts to die at Hoover Dam and tell themselves that they stand for civilization. There is an almost comic dissonance between the rhetoric of bringing back the old America and the actual practice of treating the Mojave as a tax base and a buffer zone. That dissonance is exactly the kind of self-deception Hegel explains as a form of spirit that has outlived its inner truth. Here Caesar enters as history's refusal to let that self-deception stand. His legion comes from outside the NCR and calls that entire project into question. Where the NCR carries charters and ballots, the legion carries crosses and whips. Where the NCR imagines that it can tame the wasteland through treaties, Caesar plays the Romulus and offers a founding murder. He tears into the NCR's frontier, hangs its citizens on poles, and forces its leaders to confront what they have been doing. Their claim to represent the old world's best side looks absurd when they stand across the river from a man who has read the same histories and reached a far harsher conclusion about what the moment demands. Caesar thus embodies the role that Hegel assigns to conquerors. They do not win by careful persuasion. Neither do they hold public debates or win discussions in pamphlets. They throw armies at the fragile structures of their age and shatter them. They turn latent contradictions into open crisis. The NCR must either defeat Caesar and rebuild itself with a more honest sense of what kind of power it wields, or it must crumble and see its restorationist fantasies swept away by a slave empire that at least admits that empires rule by fear. Salo's Roman imagery complicates this picture in an interesting way. On the surface, it might look like the same nostalgia that drives the NCR. He dresses his men in red, he revives Latin titles, and he talks of legions and profligates. It is tempting to say that he is as lost in the past as the republic he hates. The resemblance remains shallow, however. The NCR dreams of going back. Salo measures himself against Rome just as Julius Caesar once wept at the tomb of Alexander, and as Napoleon declared himself heir to Caesar. In each case, the past serves as a mirror for ambition rather than a blueprint for restoration. When Julius Caesar read of Alexander's conquests, he did not resolve to live in Alexander's world. He wept that he had not yet achieved comparable greatness in his own world. Napoleon reached for Roman symbols to declare that he stood in a line of founders and destroyers, not because he wanted to reinstall the Roman constitution. Their gaze toward the past was competitive. They see earlier figures as standards of scale. They aim to surpass them under new conditions. Edward Salo stands in that same tradition. His Rome is a mythic reference point, a proof that republics can decay and disciplined empires can rise from their carcasses. He borrows names and rituals as a way of branding his project and of reminding himself and his followers that they belong to the rank of serious historical actors. He does not pretend that the Mojave is Italy, nor that the NCR Senate is the Roman Senate. He reads those analogies as warnings and as goads. Rome shows him what iron rule can accomplish. The NCR shows him what happens when a republic grows fat and sentimental. Between the two, he chooses the role of the man who breaks the republic rather than the man who repeats it. Hegel would see more historical intelligence in this agonistic use of the past than in the NCR's restorative dream. The NCR clings to symbols because it cannot bear to admit that the world of those symbols died in fire. Salo invokes older empires to place his own violence in a line of world-changing acts. One mode of looking backward dulls the movement of spirit. The other accelerates it by producing someone willing to put an entire region to the test of force. Thus, Hegel would have nothing but contempt for the NCR's nostalgia, while Edward Salo's Roman fixation looks philosophically alive if grim. Freedom, unfreedom, and the role of the founder. A familiar objection now arises. Hegel's system places freedom at the center of history. Spirit advances as more people become free in a concrete, institutional sense. Caesar runs a slave army. His order reduces almost everyone around him to instruments. How can such a regime count as Hegelian at all? One, of course, must look at the difference between the goal of history and the means that history uses. Hegel does not claim that every world historical individual embodies the final shape of ethical life. Many of them, in his view, build states that fall short of true freedom. The important question is whether their action breaks a dead form and sets conditions for something more self-aware. Edward Salo does not deliver freedom as liberal comfort or a stable, rules-based order. What he does deliver is pressure. He compresses entire peoples into an engine that makes their world impossible to take for granted. Their suffering and his cruelty are real. At the same time, he makes it impossible for the Mojave to drift. Freeside, New Vegas, the NCR military, the followers, and the tribes must all make fateful choices once his legion marches in earnest. They must decide what they value, what they will accept in the name of order, what they will reject even at the cost of survival. Through that ordeal, the region gains higher self-knowledge. In Hegel's sense, that gain is part of spirit's advance. Under that pressure, institutions and frontiers stop looking like natural facts and start looking like human decisions. And that forced scrutiny is already what freedom looks like in Hegel's sense. In many endings, Caesar dies or the legion breaks. That outcome fits the pattern. Hegel never promises that the man who wields history's knife will live to see a just society. Often he dies leaving a flawed or half-formed structure behind. Later actors take that structure, modify it, and move closer to freedom. Caesar stands at the destructive stage in this chain. He is the founder whose work others must transcend. Tragedy runs through Edward Salo's story. He began as a healer and teacher. He ended as an emperor with a brain tumor and a death cult in Roman armor. A shallow reading treats this as simple corruption or hypocrisy. A deeper one sees the unity in his path. From the start, he takes ideas seriously. He believes that societies have frameworks and destinies. He believes that one can read these and act in line with them. Once he convinces himself that Rome's ruthless discipline allowed it to solve problems that destroyed other republics, he shapes his own biography to match. He abandons the followers. He steps into the role of lawgiver and conqueror. He stops treating human suffering as a problem for charity and starts treating it as material. Hegel would see a dark honesty here. The world historical individual does not shrink back when he sees what history demands. He may cloak his actions in talk of destiny, yet he still chooses them. Salo knows that he has become the sort of man he once might have tried to cure. He presses forward anyway, because to turn back would mean admitting that the last years of war and terror were pointless. That commitment to the path he has chosen, even in the face of his own illness and possible defeat, gives him tragic weight. And I quote, "Many years have passed, and by post-apocalyptic standards, Caesar's accomplishments have been prodigious. But the man's hunger for greatness has never been sated. Having assembled a loose nation of slavers and slaves, having won countless wars against inferior peoples, secretly he still feels like an upstart, an amateur, a barbaric king of the Gauls, instead of a lofty emperor of Rome. To advance, he needs two things, a Carthage and a Rome. In the NCR, he has at last found a great adversary, against which he can wage a military campaign worthy of history books. Indeed, worth teaching his subordinates how to read and write, so that future generations can read his own commentary. And in Vegas, powered and watered by its great dam, he has found a capital worthy of, well, a Caesar. Contrary to the old saw, Rome will be built in a day. End quote. From the Fallout, New Vegas official game guide. His likely end completes the picture. Whether Caesar dies of cancer on the operating table or later in his camp clutching his will stating whom his successor would be, his personal story stops once he has done his work as an agent of negation. The Mojave moves on. NCR reformers, Mr. House, Yes Man, the Courier's own rule, all these paths rest on the fact that Caesar existed and forced the region to redefine itself. His empire fades as other projects emerge from the space his wars have cleared. If we only listen to the most quoted lines from Caesar's 10th speech, he sounds like a villain who picked up on overused philosophical slogans. His use of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis cliche encourages that reading. Once we place that speech back into his biography and the structure of Hegel's thought, another picture appears. Edward Sallow reads history as a process with an inner reason. He grasps his own moment as a turning point between scattered tribal survival and large-scale political order. He rejects NCR restorationism as a refusal to learn from the fall of the old world. He builds a machine of conquest that uses cruelty, discipline, and fear as deliberate tools. He speaks about his project in language that links personal ambition to the fate of a whole region. He accepts, in deed if not in words, that he may burn out before any new Rome stabilizes. That complex of traits is exactly what Hegel ascribes to the world historical individual. These figures change history through acts that combine insight and blindness, theory and violence. They serve freedom even while they rule in ways that deny freedom, because their main gift lies in the institutional break they force. Caesar does this for the Mojave. He drags that wasteland out of a long, stunned aftermath into a crisis where every community must decide what kind of future it wants. In that sense does Edward Sallow become the Wasteland Hegelian. Hegel extols him as the ruthless founder who uses the sword, then disappears, leaving a new world to be built on the ruins he made.